This is just a brief recap of our discussion from week number 2. Again, you did a great job on the discussion. I didn't actually have to implement myself too much into the discussion because many of you made some excellent points with regards to the Barbie doll, the Fula doll, and others in the different cultures there in the Middle East. It's a difficult situation to deal with, both with dealing with the cultural nuances of the products, and also dealing with the fact that you want to honor a certain culture, but then also what we experienced with the popularity of Barbie in some of the Middle Eastern cultures is the fact that, as we mentioned in some of our postings, this concept of aspirational consumption, or having aspirational values, and I'll talk more about that. So this whole concept, especially if you're looking at the significance of what I call cultural nuances. Culture is so complex, and it's very risky if we try to make certain assumptions about a culture that may be accurate but may not be the full story. And so I think when we saw, especially if you kind of compared and contrast the success of the Fula doll relative to the Sarah and the Razane doll, if I'm saying that properly, we see some of those nuances. Fula seems to have found a good balance between respecting religion, traditional values, but yet also, because like their doll, it show her reading the Quran or praying, or the certain attire where for example, the interior skirts were below the knee or whatever. But then there was there was also a kind of a balance with regards to a little bit of the aspirational aspects where people want to just to look good or whatever, and so she had a little bit more of an attractive face, if you will, or something to that effect. But they also recognize that communication comes in nonverbal as well as verbal forms, and so I think they recognize that the doll, the Fula doll, or any doll for that matter, actually communicates certain things. It communicates certain values. It communicates who a person is. So they recognized that when consumers consume things, that sometimes those products are an extension of the consumer's personality, their values or whatever. And so that was, I think, perhaps part of it. One of my postings, I mentioned the idea of not making assumptions with regards to cultural nuances. I mentioned in my post about the inconspicuous culture that's found among many young people in Iran, how when they're out in the streets, they are fulfilling the cultural expectations and sometimes the law by wearing the full-length Arabic robes and such, and the veils. But once they get into a social situation within their own private confines of their apartment or whatever, then those traditional clothes comes off, and they look more like people you'd find in the West. And they actually listen to Western music or watch Western movies that they've been able to download or whatever. And so if we were to make the assumption that they don't like those things, then that would be a wrong assumption, because it may not be obvious when just out on the general street. But if you get to really know the consumer and what they like, then you can kind of market your products accordingly. This concept of the aspirational values, that especially when children are playing with dolls or toys or something like that, they're in a world where they want to be, or maybe they hope they would be, like kids when they're watching Disney, they want to be that princess or whatever. And so a lot of times when they're playing, they're trying to picture themselves as someone who they would like to be. And so therefore, if a doll looks exactly like them or exactly like their world, yes, they'll be able to relate to it, but that may not be what they actually want. So therefore, they may want to have a more idealized concept of that, and that may be why the Fula doll and the Barbie doll were popular. With regards to culture and consumption, Also, we don't want to make an assumption that that consumers only want what is found in their culture. A good example of this would be when Disney went and opened up their first theme park in Europe. It was in Paris. And so Disney, of course, did a lot of research on the market to try and understand the French consumers and their tastes. And so they knew that they're going to have to probably have different products in their park than what they had in their parks that were located in Los Angeles and in Orlando here in America for their first foray into a different culture. And so they put French type foods because, well, obviously the French food palate is different than the American food palate. However, the restaurants in that Disneyland theme park in Paris were not doing well. And part of the reason is because when people went to Disneyland, they wanted an American experience. They didn't want another French experience. They can get a French experience by walking down the Champs-Élysées. They wanted an American experience. So they wanted hot dogs. They wanted hamburgers. They wanted something like that. Coca-Cola. So if Disney made this assumption that, well, French people like French food, and so therefore we need to have French items on our menus and leave the hamburgers off because the hamburgers are beneath the French. Well, that's not necessarily the case. When they were at Disneyland, they wanted an American experience. So we have to sometimes recognize that in certain situations, consumers have certain expectations that may not be what you would assume them to be. So making assumptions in international marketing, especially cultural assumptions, can be pretty risky. You need to do your market research, but you also don't want to make assumptions. You have to understand the full context. As Americans, we have to struggle with that because, as we read about in our textbook with regards to Hofstede's cultural dimensions, Americans were very low context, and so we don't kind of think of the broad picture of the situation and the context in which things happen. Well, we need to be more high context thinking in those situations because when you're marketing a product overseas, there's a lot going on there. The setting of the consumption experience, the product itself, the values that consumers bring into it, all make it pretty difficult. And so, again, there are nuances to culture that we as marketers need to consider. So our discussion this week, we're going to be looking at concepts from Chapter 6 and Chapter 9. So we're going to be looking at global versus local competitors. We're going to be looking at the role that cultural attitudes cultural attitudes of competition play in marketing. And then from Chapter 9, of course, we'll look at some market entry strategies. But our discussion is going to be kind of applying these concepts to the cola wars, if you will, between Coca-Cola and some local competitors in Europe, Middle East, and in Latin America. So I look forward to our discussion this week.